Hi everyone, I'm Pam Allenstein, Plant Collections Network Manager at the Association. The Association's Professional Citation Award recognizes the significant achievements in public horticulture of an association member who has excelled in one of the disciplines generally associated with public gardens, such as botany, horticulture, gardening, conservation, research, education, extension, development, or administration. Recipients may be at the early to midpoint of their prestigious career. More importantly, the nominee should embody great skills, innovation, and potential. Since joining UBC Botanical Garden in 2014, this year's awardee has expanded the garden's education and outreach programs exponentially, and with them, the profile of the garden. Her important work has resulted in significant garden-based programming, frequent peer-reviewed publication, and wide-reaching community engagement related to conservation of natural resources, safeguarding global biodiversity, and the preservation of human culture and knowledge at local, national, and international scales. The American Public Gardens Association is pleased to present Dr. Tara Moreau with this year's professional citation. Congratulations, Tara. Hi everyone, I'm Pam Allenstein, Plant Collections Network Manager at the Association, and I will be your staff representative during this virtual conference session. Before we begin, here are a couple of tips to get the most out of your virtual conference experience. First, if you are experiencing poor video or audio quality, we suggest closing other programs on your computer, especially other browser tabs. Your inbox will still be there at the end of the session, I promise. If you have any other problems or questions, association staff are available to help. Give us a call at 610-708-3010 or send us an email at info@publicgardens.org. Second, while this session has been pre-recorded, the presenters are here with us today to answer questions, and we'll be happy to do so in a live Q&A portion after the pre-recorded session. At some point during the session, the presenters may activate a poll. Poll responses are anonymous, so please be sure to let us know how you really feel. Finally, you can submit your questions using Zoom's Q&A function that you will find at the bottom of your Zoom taskbar. Questions can be submitted anonymously, and then you can also upvote other questions to indicate that you would like to hear them answered. We will try to answer as many questions as we can during the live Q&A portion of this session. Some questions may be answered directly through the Q&A feature. Thank you, and enjoy today's session.
Okay, hello out there and welcome to our session, Exploring Decision-Making in Historic Landscape Management. My name is Kate Noel. I'm the Horticulture Manager at Filoli in Woodside, California. My co-presenters are Kenneth Darsney, Horticultural Supervisor at Nemours Estate in Wilmington, Delaware, Joshua Meyer, former Director of Buildings, Gardens, and Grounds at Tudor Place in Washington, D.C., and now the Curator and Director of Museums, Gardens, and Landscapes at Plymouth Plantation, and Edward Moydell, Executive Director of Blodell Reserve in Bainbridge Island, Washington. What inspired this session for us was being out in the field and wondering, are we doing the right thing? Hopefully you're operating with some type of framework or guidelines to steer you, but there's still uncertainty, and when you're using a chainsaw and backhoeing in the landscape, then it really can be scary way of preserving. And so the complexity and the uncertainty that are inherent in the job, we think that's what really keeps it interesting. And that's what we want to discuss with you. So there's a changing world, no kidding. We tried to capture in broad categories what are some of the things that we're most often grappling with. Climate change and environmental change is huge, and our increasing awareness of sustainability. There's a photo here of a huge, lush, cool season turf in Filoli's Mediterranean climate. Totally irresponsible historic use of resources. And so, that's something that we have to look at going forward and change. New pests and pathogens are threatening our historic plant collections, and many more things related to climate change and environmental change. It's critical that we re-examine historic narratives at our sites. We need to make changes not just to our interpretation, but to the landscape. And that's not really the focus of this presentation, but it needs its own symposium, its own conference. Public safety and access are also really key right now. A lot of our historic sites, private estates, were not designed for the type of vegetation that they have now, but how do we adapt them so that they're inclusive and the adaptations are practical and sensitive to the design. The role of public gardens and historic sites in our society is changing, and that's going to be different for every garden and for every community. And of course, financial sustainability is going to influence our decisions, but we're hoping that the case studies will speak to some of these issues. We had planned the session to be very interactive. We were going to have breakout groups. We were going to have facilitators and easels and fights breaking out, but you're at home, so you're safe from that. Hopefully you'll participate in our polls and submit questions to the chat, and at the end we'll announce the poll results and answer your questions. So to test our polling, we'd like to do a quick poll. You see here 2 images at Filoli of the Northwest Terrace. Would you A, preserve the historic plantings by the family, or B, restore the views from the historic terrace? So your answer, if it's what I'm hoping for, I'll use it to support my position. But speed polling of strangers is not accepted practice, but it's fun. So thank you for answering our first poll, and I'll hand you over to Josh Meyer and his Tudor Place case study.
Hello, I'm Josh Meyer, and today I'd like to share a case study about tackling boxwood blight at Tudor Place. It touches upon themes in public safety, organizational culture, and realities of climate change. Tudor Place is the family home of Martha Washington's granddaughter, who married into a prominent Georgetown family, the Peters. And the family continuously owned the property over 6 generations from 1805 to 1983. At over 5 acres, it is one of the most intact urban landscapes from the federal period. It was listed as a National Historic Landmark in 1966 as a property that's historically significant to the nation. And we've been a museum at Tudor Place for over 30 years. So while a notable architect designed the mansion, the grounds were entirely shaped by the family. The north gardens are defined by a series of garden rooms and supported by old-fashioned plant varieties. The south side of the property is anchored by a pastoral English-style landscape framed by stately specimen trees. The Boxwood Circle dates from the early 1800s. It was the first thing planted on site and is critical to our identity as an institution. Tudor Place and Boxwood go hand in hand. The framework of the formal gardens are also supported by several thousand feet of boxwood hedgerow. Some quick staffing resources context. For garden staff, we have 2 full-time gardeners, 1 to 2 seasonals, about 100 man-hours a month in volunteers, and 1 facilities tech. My garden and grounds budget is approximately $50,000 annually, and about 60% of that is in tree care. There are many guiding documents and frameworks controlling how this historic landscape is to be treated and preserved. This is a historic garden in the truest sense, in that very little changes can be made according to an array of governing agencies and policies. Any garden element established before 1983 is considered historic and cannot be altered unless approved by all of those governing parties. Its final owner, Armistead Peter III, created the first ever historic landscape easement with the Department of Interior. He also left a highly prescriptive and conditional will upon his death in 1983. So examples include no willow oak, boxwood on the knot garden must be kept at 16 inches wide, no landscape architects are allowed on the board, to name a few. So there's also a cultural landscape report, a master plan, and garden philosophy to hold on to. So now on to the description of the case problem. It was the 3rd week of September 2018. I just started my job earlier that month, so everything was new to me in the garden, essentially. My full-time gardener had just gave notice to take an amazing job with the Smithsonian, but also delivered some worrying news. The boxwood was not looking so good, specifically the English boxwood. We had a ton of it at Tudor Place. The concern of planting monocultures means that when something goes wrong with the plant, a lot can go wrong really fast. We knew we had to investigate these symptoms very seriously. After just a few days of observing and researching the characteristics of this issue, we realized that boxwood blight looked like a likely candidate. For those who don't know, boxwood blight is an incurable disease which is powered by an aggressive and very sticky fungus that is highly spreadable. The spores can live without a host for 5 years. It can spread from boxwood to boxwood and garden to garden by animals, weather events, and humans via clothing and shoes. After completing the 2-week disease cycle, plants are left ugly, partially defoliated, vulnerable, and still contagious. Initial visual symptoms of the disease are shown on the slide. As soon as we suspected boxwood blight, I sent samples to my cooperative extension office for testing. And because of this fast action, we were able to get the results back later that week. The news was bad. It was indeed boxwood blight. And just to further illustrate the gravity of the situation, this disease had the potential to completely destroy the critical historic framework of the landscape, which was mostly shaped by boxwood. We initially looked to the Virginia Cooperative Extension for guidance on best management practices. They did an excellent job preparing resources. There was a lot of questions to ask at this point. How do we get the disease? Are we spreading it? Are we in danger? What does this mean for us as a public garden? How do we manage this? How long will it take? How much will it cost? So the questions are endless. As the disease cycle was winding down, I mapped out the extent of the damage. All of the English boxwood collections were affected. This amounted to hundreds and hundreds of mature plants. The percentages in the map describe the extent of vegetation affected for each area. At 15%, the boxwood circle fared fairly well, but the hedgerows in the formal gardens saw up to 65% coverage. BMPs for removal of diseased vegetation are arduous and time-consuming. Everything must be carefully removed, double-bagged, and sent to landfill. The leaf drop litter must also be cleaned up, and everything must be sanitized periodically. Removing even 5 large boxwood could take 10 man-hours. So now for a description of stakeholders and choices considered. There are multiple ways to approach this problem and many stakeholders to consider or include, but bottom line, this impacted the organization in a huge way. The gardens are a primary space for events and programming. We had to be concerned about the threat of long-sustained outbreaks of boxwood blight being in an urban environment. There were area gardens, parks, and garden clubs to consider. And then we wanted to ensure that we're handling this professionally. So we reached out to experts, or reaching out to experts was also a consideration. This was simply not a departmental problem. It had museum-wide implications. After getting together with the leadership team, I presented a case study and explained the extent of our situation with its potential impacts. Collectively, we determined that there were a few general directions that we could take in strategically managing this issue. From a messaging standpoint, we saw two options. One, we could embrace this issue and transform into a community-wide initiative to manage. We actually had yet to see an organization take this approach, perhaps because most public gardens are not in dense locations and thus have no immediate physical community to alert. Or option two was to manage quietly and silently to avoid being labeled as a disease garden. This was the current status quo we saw at most gardens at the time. I reached out to many organizations and many could only speak confidentially about the garden's exposure to blight. Additionally, we also needed to align as an organization about another decision. Do we make boxwood blight management a top priority until further notice, as some gardens were doing? Or do we let the disease blow over with bare minimum recommendations? Some gardens with less funding and resources, such as ours, were also taking this approach. So now I'd like to take no more than a minute to pose a question to the audience. So poll time. Based on the information presented to you, the fact that we're an urban garden and have started out on the right foot addressing this problem as an organization and not just a hort department, what would you do? Do you publicize and openly disclose to the public the recent news of boxwood blight in the garden? So yes, no, or maybe. And so how did Tudor Place tackle this issue? Ultimately, there were a number of positive signs and influences early on that gave us a lot of confidence in knowing that we could really set a good example for the community. We spotted the disease early. I was able to tap into nationally renowned experts and authorities on the disease, and I was able to convince the leadership team that this aligns with our mission and value statements as a community resource. So in the end, we opted to embrace boxwood blight and to use our experience as a tool for sharing best practices with the community. We wanted to be fully transparent. We created a dedicated webpage to our efforts. We sent out a letter to all of our members and neighbors in the community to explain our stance. I even developed an agreement letter and pledge with area organizations certifying that we would all do our best to manage the disease based on common goals. Development altered the fundraising strategies toward the issue. We ended up looping boxwood health into several education and programming events. We worked with communication for signage, made alterations to contracts with sanitization clauses, and devised a press strategy. And all these steps were also in our best interest as well. We only wanted to deal with blight once, and if we could educate the community, we would possibly reduce the chance of future outbreaks. And then the Gardens and Grounds Department also opted to make boxwood blight health, or boxwood health in general, a top priority for the next year. I essentially developed my own panel of experts to make a plan. This slide shows the plan in visual form for each area. I consulted with the foremost expert on boxwood, Lynn Batdorf, as well as the top boxwood grower in the East Coast, Saunders Brothers, scientists from Virginia Tech, Extension, as well as area public garden directors on my garden advisory committee also weighed in. This immense collective body of knowledge enabled us as an organization to make confident decisions and in turn relay our process to the public. In the end, over 300 English boxwood plants were removed. Our diligence enabled us to save about 90% of the boxwood that was considered historic, and now they're on a long-term healthcare plan. This challenge created immense opportunities for bringing new life and stories to historic areas. Our garden is healthier and even more accurate based on our decision-making. In 2019, we replaced much of the English boxwood in the formal gardens with new gen variety boxwood. This is the most blight-resistant kind out there and was not available to the trade until a few months ago. I believe we were the first public garden even in the country to get new gen. And after much deliberation, we also removed several historic but declining specimens that outgrew their spaces and muddied the framework of the garden. And then our decision to be open and transparent with this issue via public outreach and education paid off immensely. We were awarded a grant from the Georgetown Garden Club recognizing our leadership, with the amount essentially covering all of our boxwood costs for 2019. And then overly positive press. We were featured or mentioned in journals from the American Boxwood Society, and brought into popular culture with Garden and Guns magazine with a good feature. The White House even invited me out to consult on their boxwood and asked me to join their advisory committee. So had we decided to keep blight a secret and do the bare minimum BMPs, our results and outcomes would have been only minimally successful. And that's the story of boxwood blight at Tudor Place. So I guess the most important points I hope to leave you with today are the following. A, always be prepared to assemble and develop a team of experts to advocate for your cause. B, get buy-in from leadership. Don't go it alone. I was incredibly fortunate that our leadership team rallied behind this cause, and it would have not have been as great of a success without their support. And then C, as long as you have science and BMPs on your side, embrace the challenges and disasters and use them to your advantage to create opportunities, new donors, new friends, new spaces, and new stories. And next, I'd like to hand it off to Ken Darsney with New Moors for another case study.
All right, thank you for that, Josh. I'm now completely paranoid about my boxwood display. My name is Ken Darsney. I am the manager of Gardens and Grounds here at Nemours Estate. Nemours Estate, a former home and garden of Alfred DuPont, built between 1910 and 1935, officially opened to the public in 1980. The gardens consist of a 300-acre property, about 90 of which is formal gardens built in the French style. A unique property of our estate is that the trust that established the property to be open to the public and for it to be preserved also provided for the construction of the Alfred I. DuPont Children's Hospital. In the top picture, you can see the hospital in the background, our mansion in the foreground. We do share the same campus. The bottom picture there shows the 2014 expansion right up against our water tower. The hospital is part of the Nemours Foundation, which is a health network that spans 6 states across the country. So for a long time, from when the property was first opened in 1980 to 2014, it operated under the same model. It was very restrictive. It was 3 tours a day, and it was a reservation-only guided tour. Groups were limited to no more than 50 people, and no children were allowed on the property. The tours were heavily guided. Guides would walk guests through the mansion and through a very small part of the garden. Most of the garden was experienced through a garden tram tour. In 2014, with some change in leadership, we moved to completely change the format to open access. Guests can now spend as much time as they want. They can explore all areas of the garden by foot. And, of course, children are now allowed. So as you could probably imagine, the challenges for switching that kind of format were numerous to the point of overwhelming. Guest safety became a priority. Guests can now access areas of the garden they could never access before. We needed restrooms out on the property. We needed signage. There was never a need for signage because a guide was right next to the guests to tell them where they were at all times. And we have been tackling these challenges one by one over the course of the last 6 years. One of the largest hurdles that has been ongoing is accessibility. So because the property was built in 1910, 1935, it was not built to incorporate strollers. It was not built to incorporate wheelchairs. So now most 90%, between 85 and 90% of every walkway in the entire garden is built with white pea gravel over a crushed stone base. Now, pea gravel itself is not only ADA non-compliant, it's difficult for strollers. It's very difficult for walking in general. It is, however, the original historic fabric of the property. So as we go about this decision process, we have stakeholders, as Josh mentioned as well. The big drivers for the internal stakeholder discussion was our mission and vision, and the 4 S's, which I'll touch upon later. Hospital associates, we share a campus and we are partnered with the hospital in many different ways. Our own executive leadership team, our staff, our board of directors, all who are on the same board as far as what we are trying to do. Externally, hospital patients and families, they have access to this property like never before. Visitors, especially visitors now with strollers that never had access to this property before 2014. and then the community at large. So we're at that point now where we need to decide what we can do and what are the options. What have we considered? And we've considered entire removal and replacement of all the pea gravel with a aesthetically similar product, i.e. Exposed aggregate concrete, for example, and removing all the pea gravel and replacing it with that product. We've discussed selective replacement with just exposed aggregate throughout certain areas of the property. We have discussed using different materials in different areas. Of course, is the argument, it's been fine for 40 years, so why change it? And then all of this is driven, all of those decisions are born from our internal mantra of the 4 S's: safety, stewardship, sustainability, and story. So I have 2 questions for my poll. When we went to this open access, we of course greatly expanded the amount of guests that access the property. So do you feel that limiting visitation helps you to better preserve a landscape for future generations? And that could be a yes, no, or maybe. Obviously, with more guests, there's more impact on the historic fabric of the property. However, that's less access to your story and to your collections. And secondly, would you support altering a 100-plus-year-old original landscape design at a historic garden? So for us, when it came down to the decision, it came down to our why. It was driven by the mission and vision of our founder, and again, our internal mantra of the 4 S's. Safety, safety is paramount above all. We don't do anything or make any changes that compromises the safety of our guests or our staff. Stewardship, we are constant stewards of our property and our collections. Sustainability, the word sustainability doesn't really ring in your ear when you think of a formal French garden. There's very little sustainable about that. So it's been our internal mission to drive that garden into a more sustainable model moving forward. And of course, the story of what was there. And can we achieve all of this by removing or changing the pea gravel fabric? And the answer was mixed. We have moved forward with multiple approaches in multiple areas. This is a decomposed granite and polymer base. We started with prioritization of areas, and these are going to be areas of the garden that you could not access unless you walked through grass or down steps. And that's where we've used this product more than some of the others. Very simple application. It's aesthetically pleasing. On the left, you can see that's the application about a month after it was installed. And on the right, that's now 4 years later with very little maintenance. You can barely see the tire tracks of our garden carts. So this is another area where we were able to use the decomposed granite, an area a guest could not usually walk through unless they walk through grass. This was, again, an easy call. But getting to where we've replaced the pea gravel, what we have found is when we look hard at the areas of the garden and their uses and their needs, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. So, for example, one area might use flagstone, dry-laid flagstone. One area might use concrete. And then this picture on the right is an interesting mix of the decomposed granite and the pea gravel, which has given us the historic element of the pea gravel with a more durable surface. So when we get down to the big question of how you make these decisions, it starts with knowing your why. Know your mission, know your vision, get your stakeholders on the same page as much as possible, and it makes all of these decisions one by one way easier. So with that, I thank you, and I'd like to kick it over to Ed Moydell of Blowdell Reserve.
Howdy, everybody. I'm Ed Moydell. I'm the Executive Director of the Blowdell Reserve. Blowdell Reserve is a 150-acre experiential public garden and forest preserve off the coast of Seattle on Bainbridge Island. We were founded by Prentice and Virginia Blowdell. Prentice Blowdell was a conservation pioneer and was the reluctant heir to his dad's timber company. He was an early advocate of the benefits that come from immersion in nature to human health. The Blowdells developed the property over the course of about 40 years from the early 1950s through the mid-1990s. We are fortunate to live in a climate where almost anything grows, so we have about 5,000 different kinds of plants. One of the things that's unique about Blodell is, I think, not only its sense of place, but also there are some places that specialize in formal landscapes, some that specialize in natural landscapes. We really have sort of the full spectrum of them. And also, for those of you who manage natural gardens, it's amazing how much work it takes to make something look natural. So one of our unique characteristics is the sort of visibility, the absence or presence of the human hand. Blodell Reserve is comprised of about 25 different landscapes. I'm presenting today from the perspective of a historic garden that is not a preservation garden. Our founders, even though they spent about 40 years developing the property, summarized their intentions for the property in less than about 2 pages. So we as successors were limited with our understanding of what the original design intent was, and that created some real issues with a lack of shared understanding of what the place was about, what the driving purpose for it was, and ultimately what we needed to do moving forward. So what I want to talk with you about today are some bigger picture tools that we have developed in stewarding our garden for future generations, and then how we have utilized those on effectively what's the biggest landscape renovation we've done in 40 years. So a little bit more about Blodell, bigger picture. Our vision, this is the founder's vision, is very experiential. We're a place where people find refreshment and tranquility in the presence of natural beauty. Last decade, we added to that a mission statement, which really brought in the community and about the impact that we make in people's lives. Still, the purpose of the place was, for lack of a better word, kind of squishy. So we tried to develop some mission pillars that help demonstrate what impacts our facility had to people and to the community. So those mission pillars really start with the site. Horticulture and design is what everything else is built on top of. Conservation and stewardship is taking care of the site for the next 100+ years, and then what the site does to people who visit. The site inspires creativity and inspiration. It also enhances well-being through immersion in nature. So in 2015, we found ourselves in a situation where we knew we had a really unique piece of landscape architecture and landscape design, but we were at an impasse on what to do moving forward. We had just developed a master plan, and that master plan did not address the horticulture in the gardens, because that was one area of real strength for the property. We invited in a horticulture peer review. Ken mentioned earlier that they had tapped into different experts, and that had been of real benefit to them. It was transformational for us. So we invited in a group of experts to ask them what we did well, what we needed to work on in the future. And one of the answers that they provided to us was to a question that we didn't even ask. They came back and said we had a really unique piece of property. It was very important. And we also ran the risk of losing it all through the gradual erosion of design intent, because we didn't know what we had. So we undertook some significant research projects over the course of a couple of years to better understand the gardens, what they were intended for, how they changed through time, and what really makes them what they are. The first one here is the Heritage Landscape Report. This served as the definitive history and evolution of the property, garden by garden, decade by decade, to help sort of establish what the place was and help eliminate mythology that arises from a historic property. So you can see here on our property, we have 25 different landscape areas divided into 4 major zones. We have pastoral, natural landscapes. In the center of the garden are more ornamental landscapes. We have about 75 acres of preserved forest, so we have woodland experiences. And then we kind of have the back 40 and support systems, which are education and maintenance zone. This is supremely blurry and impossible to read, but this was an incredibly helpful exercise for us from the Heritage Landscape Report. Across the side here are those 25 different garden features. Across the top are different periods of time separated by about a decade or so. And it shows across the property over time what was happening within these landscapes when they were developed, and what themes they represented in the development of the property. We also have another slide that does this with designers and landscape architects. So this was an excellent tool for our stakeholders to better understand the development of the property. Taking that a step further, we also were able to compare aerial photographs of each part of the property over time. So aerials from the 50s, the 70s, 80s, 90s, and what was then present day. This is a study of the part of the property I'm going to show you that was our landscape project. So this depicts the change in forest canopy, the change in plant material, the change in water over time, and it also helps relate that to whether or not those changes were purposeful or accidental or just with the advancement of time. We carried the step of documenting the history of the property further beyond the Heritage Landscape Report with a second volume we called the Character Defining Features Report. This really looked at each one of the garden spaces and helped to identify what made it what it was from an experiential standpoint and from a character standpoint. So there's a multiple page spreadsheet for each one of the landscapes that helps document this. We established values for each one of them. Those relate to history, the founders, ecology, design, our ability to educate. Also, it summarizes what the landscape was during the period of significance, which for us was 1994. And then it also summarizes what the current state is and if there are any particular issues that need to be dealt with. Then in really excruciating but helpful detail, summarizes each one of the areas of character from topography and circulation to vegetation and structures, buildings, water, views. We also added in some additional ones for us that related to sensory experiences, summarized those in the period of significance, compared them to the current day, and then identified if there were any issues that had to be dealt with. And I wanted to do a quick pause here for my audience poll to ask a question. It seems like a heritage landscape report or a cultural landscape report is common for a preservation garden, but I was curious about how many people on the call had taken it a step further to understand the character of landscapes in this kind of detail. And your options are yes and no. So quickly, I wanted to cover a case study of how we used these documents in the renovation of a particular garden landscape at the reserve that was in need of some renovations. So the Buxton Bird Marsh and Meadow was created in the late 1970s as a sanctuary for migratory nesting birds. Over time, we had developed some issues with an increased number of guests. Our property has seen an increase of about 300% in guests. And we also have inopportune circulation patterns. Over time, we had reduction in canopy diversity. Also, marginal plantings were reduced, and all of that then led to a reduction in bird species overall. This is an example of a repeat photograph that helps to demonstrate the habitat tree loss that occurred over time. On the left was one from about 20 years ago, and on the right was one from just a few years ago. So for us, the stakeholders, we were trying to find a balance between really what was good for birds, wildlife, and pollinators, and what was good for guests. And then we had to balance design and ask our question about whether or not we could maintain the original intent or honor it and expand upon the original intent. Ultimately, what we decided to do was to honor and expand upon the original intent. Here's a concept for what the plan was for the landscape expansion. This area here surrounding the pond, this was what the original circulation pattern was, really just hugging along the pond pathways. This meadow here, which is about 5 acres, was never open to the public. So what we wanted to do was to create immersive experiences along the water, but then take the trail up, take advantage of property that wasn't utilized, and make it good for birds and good for people. A couple of early concepts for the resulting design here. We had expanded platforms overlooking wetlands to improve circulation, and also putting in a pollinator meadow and hedgerow to help enhance bird diversity and pollinator diversity. We finished this project in November of last year. These are just a couple pictures of the finished product. This is a expanded platform that helps with circulation. We paid special attention to make sure that the materials mimicked surrounding landscapes and other landscapes around the reserve. These new seating areas echo the design and materials of the Japanese garden. And then here is the meadow plantings about a year in. So we seeded this with a custom seed mix. We planted plugs, and this is a grand experiment. We don't know how it's going to work out, but all of the seed mix, the design system for this had taken into account the historic vision for this, but expanded it out really to address new audiences and new issues that we face with climate change, with our desire to be more public and to offer better experiences to our guests. So that closes up my portion of the presentation.
Thank you for participating in this session. Hopefully sometime in the future we can all get together in person and tackle some of this tough stuff that historic landscapes throw at us. Here on this slide is our email contact information. Please don't hesitate to reach out. We're interested to hear what you're undertaking at your gardens. I think that how landscapes are preserved yet adapted over time is a really interesting lens to look at our evolving culture, and some of the change on our sites is going to be visible, as in these examples, but some of it will be operational or just our way of thinking. So on the scale of our careers, we'll see change, we'll be change, we'll preserve. So good work out there. Good luck. Thank you. I am here to share the results of the poll. For our first poll, 40% of people wanted to keep the camellia, while 60% prefer to restore the view. So pretty close one. 75% of people voted that they believe that it's a responsibility of public gardens to publicize pathogens in their collections, even if they can responsibly control the outbreak. Although 25% said no or maybe, so there is some uncertainty there. Does limiting visitation better preserve a landscape for the future? That is pretty much split between yes, no, and maybe. 26% say yes, 44%, the largest group, say no, and 30% say maybe. Would you support altering a 100-year-old original landscape design at a historic garden? 46% are ready to do that, 12% are not, and 42% said maybe. And have character-defining features been described for areas of your site in a cultural landscape report or another written document? Pretty much 50-50 split here. So that's very interesting. Thank you for voting and sharing your opinions with us. I think we had what we hoped for, which was a range of opinions on all these tricky questions. I can ask some of the questions out of the Q&A to you guys about your case studies here. Ed, what types of interpretation do you employ?
The short answer is not nearly enough. So because we are an experiential garden, we have a policy of having no active interpretation or messaging on the grounds or in the gardens themselves. So the stories that we tell really are in the public buildings. Interestingly enough, the scope and scale of the bird marsh was, I think, the first time maybe in history that we've had any interpretive panels that set it up to tell the story of what was happening, because it was so different than normal. But that's something we're thinking about, is how to tell the story better. And unfortunately, that's not, I could get a lot of ideas from other people on that one.
Was your heritage landscape completed in-house, or did you bring in outside consultants?
We had a lot of outside help with that. We worked with Patricia O'Donnell from Heritage Landscapes on both our Heritage Landscape Report and character defining features. And it was something that took place over the course of about 24, 30 months, something like that.
In all of your projects, your landscapes are going to continue to change, your visitation is going to continue to change, everything's going to continue to change. With each of your projects, did you plan in the future for any type of reevaluation or reassessment? And if so, what does that look like?
I can give that a shot. We've done probably 15 5-year plans in the past year. It's a constant reevaluation of where we are now and where we need to be and where we need to constantly adapt to keep moving.
I think
Josh,
one of
we
the
can't
things,
hear you. Well, while Josh is getting her sound off, I'll just read one of the comments here. And Andrea is curious about how to embrace layered landscapes, landscapes with multiple layers of history in the context of a historic garden. I am too. Is that something that any of you guys have looked? Each of your landscapes actually has mostly one historic founder, but I'll talk about Filoli, where we do have, well, actually I take that back. All of our landscapes are very layered, going back to native peoples and early settlers. So yeah, that's absolutely something that we're trying to figure out. And I would be interested to hear from all of you examples of your gardens.
sounds like a great session for next year. And so for us with a bird marsh, that's sort of what we were thinking, was that it had this history that we wanted to preserve and then add a layer on top of it to enhance it. I mentioned earlier that we were not a preservation garden, but we're a historic garden. And that's sort of what I mean is, I don't think any one of our gardens are frozen in time. We're informed by the past and we move forward with that in the future, but it's a dynamic situation.
Trying this one more time. Can anybody hear me? Can you hear me now? Oh, cool. It's going in. Okay. So I think the question was back to frameworks in the future. At Tudor Place, we're dealing with boxwood blight, and there's no cure to that disease. So it's something we're assessing and reassessing every year with new contingencies. Luckily, the market is adapting appropriately, and there's new cultivars and varieties out there that are more receptive and more resistant to the disease, but we're also looking at other replacement options. So I think it's one of those things where we just have to constantly be reassessing our options and knowing what we can do to help mitigate and adapt, because there's just going to be more, I think, like this. So I think everyone's kind of touched upon that, and Kate, you touched upon climate change and IPM issues. So I think it's just going to be the new norm, is just kind of getting these new diseases or biological pathogens that are new to us, and sometimes they'll change and go away, and be blown away and go away with time. But it looks like the blight's going to stay around for a while, so it's just something we're continuously going to be reassessing and reassessing. So
Thanks, Josh, and thanks, everybody. I'm sorry, but we're going to have to end it there. We are out of time. That's all the time we have for this session. If you'd like to keep the discussion going, please click the Live Discussions tab on the conference website and start a topic. We'd like to thank our presenters and all of you for being a part of today's session. Please stay tuned for 2 short announcements from the association. At 3:05 p.m. Eastern Time, you'll have the difficult choice of 3 more wonderful concurrent sessions on pollinators, ecosystem restoration, and climate action before our special final session, Idea Cafe. Thank you all for coming.
Good morning from the Jensen Olson Arboretum in Juneau, Alaska, on the shores of Alaska's Inside Passage.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Beck, Director of Programs and Education for the Association, and here to talk to you for a moment about the Association's Program Selection Committee. Every year, committee members work hard during the fall and winter, poring over each session submissions and making the tough decisions about which ones are going to make the cut for the annual conference. They play an enormous role in our conference experience. For this year's conference, we reviewed 141 proposals and approved 79 of them. And then we started the conference planning all over again this spring. We couldn't present every session we would have liked to. We simply didn't have time available. Some of our presenters weren't able to make the transition to an online role. Still others, unfortunately, found themselves separated from their gardens. And we also wanted to be sure that when we put together content for this virtual conference, that it would really represent the new reality in which we find ourselves, a changed world. I hope you will agree with me that they did a terrific job making this virtual conference relevant and timely. So at this time, I'd like to give a special recognition to the members of this committee and to our chair, Clayton Bass, for his and their service and dedication to their important role. From all of us here watching, thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Cynthia Druckenbrode, Chairman of the Council of Communities for the Association. The Association's 21 professional communities are groups of garden professionals from across the public horticulture industry. I'd like to thank all of the volunteer chairs and vice chairs of our association communities for their hard work and dedication throughout the year. The community forums on the association website are places where you can exchange ideas and information with your fellow garden professionals. Many of them have had informative town hall meetings in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, sharing experiences and best practices. Community members also get informative, targeted newsletters every month with upcoming professional development opportunities and recently added resources to the Association Library and Media Center. You will also find these when you log in onto the Association website and are directed to the member dashboard. Usually, these groups would be having their annual meetings at the conference, but this year, those meetings will be virtual and they will be taking place across July and August. If you are a member of a professional community, thank you. Be active in your community. If you're not, please consider joining one or more of them. It's easy. Just go to the association website, publicgardens.org, and log in using your work email address. You'll find yourself on the member dashboard where you can find links to join a professional community. Enjoy.